Again, good morning. I'm Richard Ellings, president of NBR, since before many of you were born. Not a single promotion in 30 years. Sad, very sad. I originally proposed that we hold this wonderful assembly on the beach at a place called Marymore Park. It's a glorious place just down the hill from the Microsoft headquarters and campus in Redmond, the real Washington. That idea didn't fly. So protesting, actually, my plane didn't include my bag. I am dressed like I was out in Redmond. I apologize for that. Thank you, Dan Ohm, for lending me your jacket and tie. This is a plug for working at NBR. In emergencies, they even dress you. We're here, in fact, for deadly serious discussions, and we can only hold them in our nation's capital. So welcome to this year's Asia Policy Assembly, where I can assert confidently the most important and urgent issues for America and the world, for humankind, I argue, will be addressed. The Indo-Asia Pacific, including Russia, is the locus of world power and ideological, political, and economic competition. And arguably, we're in a period of greatly heightened insecurity and potential for conflict. The topics here today and tomorrow are indeed weighty. Before going into these topics and any further, I'd like to recognize and give special thanks here right at the outset. First to Admiral Fritz Rogi, President of National Defense University, Dr. Laura Junor, who directs the Institute for National Security Studies at NDU, for being our great partners in the endeavor we call the National Asia Research Program, of which the Assembly is a part. I'd also like to thank an old friend, Phil Saunders, of NDU, and NBR Senior VP Roy Camphausen for their leadership of the program. Give special thanks to Ali Silvestre, who directs much of the work of the program, fellows, and who put this event together. Thanks to them all. The National Asia Research Program, or NARP, was created to be a bridge between academe and policy. And that bridge had several functions. One, to provide policymakers with a deeper understanding of the Asia and Indo-Pacific regions by drawing upon the very best from academe. Second, to provide rising scholars who are devoted to original ideas and research, to provide them with a stronger incentive to focus on issues in Asia of relevance to United States interests. And third, to provide these scholars with effective access to the policy community. With regard to this last point, the National Asia Research Program Fellows are provided opportunities to develop research, writing, and presentation skills geared toward a policy-oriented audience. At the conclusion of their research projects, fellows have the opportunity to engage with government policymakers on the research that they publish. Early this year, NBR and the Institute for National Security Studies at NDU reviewed competitive applications for the NARP Fellowship Program. The 20 scholars who were selected represent more than 19 different universities and research institutions from 13 states across America. Institutions such as Stanford, University of Maine, Stimson Center, Navy War College, Texas A&M, University of Missouri, and so on. Among this group, we have experts in a variety of regions of Northeast Asia and Russia, down to the South Pacific and South Asia, and topical focuses ranging from grassroots politics and tech transfer to economics and military strategy. Together, they represent an expansive and comprehensive view of Asia. As fellows, these 20 scholars each is conducting a policy-relevant research project for the NARP. And over the next 2 days here at the Asia Policy Assembly, their work is integrated and their preliminary findings from their research are integrated into the various panels and breakdown sessions. The research undertaken by the fellows is critical in light of the states involved. in this challenging region. We'll be discussing this at some length, but to both look at this set of issues comprehensively today, is to say that it's a complex international situation is an understatement. So it has to be a deep dive. We can't just skim across the top of these things. And I'm hoping you're going to stay with us, therefore, for the full 2 days. We have a maturing competition. I think we're all aware, and there's very importantly, a growing bipartisan consensus appreciating this competition and what drives it. So, let me just conclude here just a few opening remarks to say that we're looking forward to the next 2 days. We're looking forward to the scholarship that this program is going to produce. And I hope that you're fully engaged and appreciate the fact that this program, its national scope, and many of the younger folks you've not met before, and are bringing them to you. Anyway, thank you very much. Admiral Rogi.
Well, good morning, everybody. I am Vice Admiral Fritz Rogi, President of the National Defense University, and I'm delighted to just briefly add my own welcome to you to this 2019 Asia Policy Assembly. As a recent commander of the U.S. Pacific Submarine Force, I have a keen personal recognition of the crucial importance the Indo-Pacific region plays in U.S. security policy, and along with our partners, friends, and allies. And therefore, also, I think, a keen appreciation of the importance of having high-quality, thoughtful research to inform policy and strategy. That's why NDU is proud to partner with the National Bureau of Asian Research to co-sponsor both the National Asia Research Program and, of course, this Asia Policy Assembly. So thank you for joining us and contributing to this important dialogue. During the next 2 days, you'll get a chance to engage with leading experts and senior policymakers to discuss critical policy issues in the Indo-Pacific. Conveniently, they are the issues that are already addressed in this ambitious program, almost as if by design. Much of the discussion will focus one way or another on China. And as the strategic competition heats up, it is critical to have our best possible understanding of activities in the region and around the world, how it affects the United States and our allies and partners, and what policy initiatives will best advance our interests. So the discussion over the next 2 days will provide valuable input and understanding to help develop more effective policy and strategy. And I am especially pleased that, as Dr. Ellings referred to, you will have the opportunity to hear from and be informed by the research of our fellows of the 2019 National Asia Research Program as they present their research findings. The strategic goal of this program is to connect some of the nation's brightest young Asia scholars with the Washington, D.C. policy community. And this is a great group of experts with many useful insights, so I hope that not only will you enjoy learning of their work, but you take the opportunity to get to know them and to learn from them. And again, finally, I would like to again thank Rich and the National Bureau of Asian Research, and of course, NDU's own Institute for National Strategic Studies under Dr. Laura Junor for their leadership and the great work of their teams to organize this policy assembly. So please join me in thanking all of them for their efforts. And thank you once again for joining us. And again, welcome.
Thank you very much, Senator. Senator, I'm just one step ahead. He's going to run for office next year. Anyway, Admiral Rogi. It is my enormous honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Senator Cory Gardner. Senator Gardner has deep, deep roots in the American West, and that alone makes us appreciate him, or at least I do, and his fine family. He happens also to be an important guy in this town. Serves on important committees, including energy and natural resources and so on, But from our perspective, of course, also commerce, science, transportation, but from our perspective this morning, it's the Foreign Relations Committee and his chairmanship of the subcommittee on East Asia, the Pacific, and international cybersecurity policy that commands our attention. Critical to Congress's efforts to shape U.S. policy in Asia, Senator Gardner led the initiative to greatly tighten our sanctions on North Korea. He conceived, sponsored, and saw into law the bipartisan Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, which requires the administration to develop a strategic vision for U.S. policy in the Indo-Pacific and produce annual reports on issues ranging from engagement with ASEAN, the strategy for negotiations with North Korea, intellectual property protection from Chinese theft. This is something, as you know, of great interest to NBR and our IP Commission, and other topics. This act authorizes also $1.5 billion each year to advance U.S. interests in the region in partial response to Belt and Road. And it recognizes the vital importance to the United States of our treaty allies and our partners, including Taiwan. And a special mention, in fact, about Taiwan. He's made a special commitment to Taiwan and made clear in his recent visit there our commitment as a country. During that visit, he emphasized our commitment as a country to work not just with Taiwan, but other nations to improve Taiwan's recognition and stature internationally. He backed something called the Taipei Act in Congress. In addition, Senator Gardner co-introduced a resolution which passed the Senate to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the signing of the Taiwan Relations Act. I happened to be there was a guest at Tsai Ing-wen's inauguration and the passing of the torch and the presidential seal and all that between President Ma and Tsai Ing-wen, President Tsai. It's an extraordinary event to see democracy working in Asia. Extraordinary. There wasn't a dry eye in the House. It was a little hot out there, so some of it might have been sweat, but there were tears as well. And you got to go there. You have to understand just how homegrown now democracy is right off the Chinese coast. And what an example, what a model. In any case, Senator Gardner is going to share his thoughts today on the next steps on these issues and others. Some reflections, I understand, on the Shangri-La dialogue, which you recently attended, and maybe highlighting some opportunities and challenges ahead for Congress in shaping our policy in the region. Senator Gardner, it's a great pleasure and honor.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you all today. It's great to see you bright and early, 8 o'clock at this beautiful, beautiful hotel and room. Admiral, thank you very much for your leadership as well. And please don't take the demotion of Senate. You're doing great. So thank you very much for your leadership. And I just want to thank, of course, the National Bureau of Asian Research for inviting me to this morning's breakfast. And I think it's important to note that as we gather here, there are millions of Hong Kongers who are on the streets and have taken to the streets to demonstrate their love for freedom. Freedom from coercion, freedom from authoritarianism, and freedom to choose their future. And they've already succeeded beyond their wildest imagination. Not only because the Hong Kong authorities realized that the folly of the so-called extradition bill and have appeared to withdraw it, but also because on the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, the demonstrators have shown to the world that Chinese democracy on China's soil is still alive and well. And it is perfectly compatible with Chinese culture and history. And we celebrate their victory today. Let us hope and pray that it will lead to a revitalization of democratic institutions throughout Asia, that this will be a time remembered as a step forward and not a pause in freedom's decline. Promoting democracy and human rights will be vital for the United States to succeed in the Indo-Pacific and to prevail in the era of the so-called great power competition with Russia and China. These values are what differentiates the United States from the competition. These values are just and right, and they are worth fighting for. 2 weeks ago, I returned from a visit to Asia, which included stops at the Shangri-La Dialogue and in Taiwan. At the Shangri-La Dialogue, I had the unique opportunity, the unique pleasure of speaking on a panel with both my Russian and Chinese counterparts. As I stated in my prepared remarks in Singapore, the Indo-Pacific is home to 5 United States Security Treaty allies. The Indo-Pacific is home to nearly half of the world's population and half of the world's economic activity. There is no conceivable scenario where the United States will be forced out of this region by any other power. The United States is here to stay because we are a Pacific power, a Pacific nation, grounded in the rule of law, dedicated to global peace, prosperity, and security. And we will spare no effort to uphold this peaceful effort, this order that has benefited all nations in this region. Suffice it to say that my Russian and Chinese friends on that panel had a slightly different take on the matter. But in order to succeed, the United States will need to pursue 2 significant policy course corrections. The first challenge will be securing our network of allies and alliances in the Indo-Pacific. And this cannot be a paper diplomacy-based approach. It must be the strong U.S. presence and strong U.S. presence based. That is why for the last several years, I have worked on legislation called the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, or ARIA. ARIA reaffirmed the United States' commitment to our allies and partners in this region and provided a blueprint for the future United States policies in the Indo-Pacific. ARIA provides authorization, as was mentioned in the introduction, of an additional $10 billion over 5 years to enhance security cooperation, economic engagement, and a firm commitment to advance the fundamental values of human rights and the rule of law in the Indo-Pacific. ARIA incorporates and elaborates on the administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, the defining element of which is the enduring United States commitment to uphold international law, to maintain an Indo-Pacific that is free of coercion, military, economic, or in violation of human rights and economic freedom. ARIA has codified this vision of the free and open Indo-Pacific. It's codified it into U.S. law. Other U.S. leaders present at the Shangri-La Dialogue, most prominently Acting Secretary of Defense Patrick Shanahan, extrapolated on this vision. The Department of Defense, in their Indo-Pacific Strategy Report, which was released in conjunction with Acting Secretary Shanahan's speech on June 1st, said the following: "The Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, a major bipartisan legislation, was signed into law by President Trump on December 31st, 2018. This legislation enshrines a generational whole-of-government policy framework that demonstrates U.S. commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific region and includes initiatives and promotes sovereignty, rule of law, democracy, economic engagement, and regional security. It is a resounding endorsement, and now we will work closely with the administration and Congress to provide funding to create the new programs moving forward through ARIA." The second element of long-term U.S. success in the Indo-Pacific will be a much broader, concerted national challenge of enhancing instruments of U.S. national power. As George Kennan, the famed American diplomat in Moscow, wrote in his long telegram in 1946, "Much depends on the health and vigor of our own society. World communism is like a malignant parasite which feeds only on diseased tissue. This is the point at which domestic and foreign policies meet. Every courageous and incisive measure to solve internal problems for our own society, to improve self-confidence, discipline, morale, and community spirit of our own people is a diplomatic victory over Moscow worth 1,000 diplomatic notes and joint communiques." He was right, and America ultimately prevailed. But dealing with a rising China will be a much more challenging proposition. Today's China is less ideological than the Soviets, and thus much more effective at feasting on diseased tissue. diseased tissue of societies, including corruption, repression, and lack of transparency. China is also much better financially equipped to challenge the U.S. economic primacy and to advocate for an alternative vision, as we have seen and demonstrated by the largesse thrown behind the One Belt, One Road initiative and the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. And as we have seen in the East and South China Seas, China's power projection capabilities are rapidly growing and increasingly threatening our allies and our interests. It is evident from China's recent behavior that China's respect for international law and international agreements is entirely superficial and only based on its own narrow interests. This cannot stand, and the United States must work with our allies and partners to challenge China's excessive claims and assert our freedom of navigation and international overflights and rights which are protected under international law. But as Acting Secretary Shanahan reiterated at the Shangri-La dialogue, we compete with China where we must. But competition does not mean conflict. Competition is not to be feared. We should welcome it, provided that everyone plays by internationally established rules. In the long run, competition with China will require us to renew our commitment to investing in America's defense, investing in America's people, and investing in America's global edge in innovation and technology. This week in the Senate, we are taking a good step forward with the consideration of the National Defense Authorization Act, which would provide a record $750 billion investment in our nation's defense needs. America has been and always will remain an Indo-Pacific nation. Through immense courage and sacrifice, this nation created in the wake of destructive global conflict an international rules-based order that has benefited all, including China. We must protect this global order at all costs, and we can do so by leading with our values. Following my visit to the Shangri-La dialogue, I went to Taiwan to witness yet another extraordinary example of democracy with Chinese characteristics. Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen was kind enough to take me on a walk through the neighborhood of Daocheng, considered the birthplace of Chinese democracy. As we walked together through the heart of Taipei, with a throng of well-wishers greeting her, their democratically elected leader, I thought, could we see this same scene in Beijing or Shanghai? Time will tell, but as it currently stands, the authoritarian rise of a powerful China represents a significant policy challenge to the United States. We can and we will meet this challenge. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you here today, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Hi, I'm So Young from Radio Free Asia. You just mentioned about the competition between the United States and China, and I don't know if you may see the news that Xi Jinping is planning to visit North Korea soon amid this negotiation between the U.S. and North Korea is kind of stalled. So how do you see this? Do any comments on this? And then how does the United States react to this current issues and circumstance?
Well, I would encourage China President Xi to continue to do more to enforce international law and to enforce any number of United Nations resolutions, Security Council resolutions that have been put in place to enshrine a maximum pressure against the North Korean regime. I continue to be very concerned that Kim is following the Kim family playbook of delay and status quo. And I see no reason to believe at this point that he is doing anything different than what his father or his grandfather did. The United States should continue to apply maximum pressure. I am concerned that pressure by the United States has lessened as well. And I think that is a serious mistake in our approach to North Korea. And so I would encourage the United States to reach out and continue its outreach to China, encouraging Chinese that are violating international sanctions policies. And I certainly would encourage this administration to not be fooled by the status quo, to not be fooled by the Kim family playbook, and to once again move forward with a policy of maximum pressure that brought Kim Jong-un to the negotiating table the first time.
Thank you very much. Voice of America, Russian Service. Thank you, Senator, first for your different activities, including the U.S. Helsinki Commission, which is closer to my activity. My question to you is, you just mentioned Shangri-La dialogue, and you spoke with some Russian representatives. What was it about? And also, can you tell us, what do you think about Russia-China possible alliance and the balance between their ties and their contradictions? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was interesting. My colleague on the panel from Russia, who was a minister in, I think he was assistant minister of defense in Russia, spent most of his time concerned with the name Indo-Pacific, and that the name Indo-Pacific was an egregious affront to the world. Now, I found that a little bit amusing because we were in the Indo-Pacific, hosted by the Indo-Pacific to talk about the Indo-Pacific, and the topic of the conversation was the Indo-Pacific, so I'm not sure they were in step with the rest of the Indo-Pacific. So again, I think it was this the comment that they were concerned that the Indo-Pacific wasn't an inclusive term that they could embrace. Well, the Indo-Pacific has embraced the term, and I think that's what we will continue to focus on, a free and open Indo-Pacific. Perhaps they don't like the free and open part of the Indo-Pacific. When it comes to the China sort of Russia partnership, it'll be interesting to see how their long-term interests can play out, and where their long-term benefits and where their long-term interests or natural allies really take them. And so for now, of course, you have a declining power and a rising power that have found a mutually beneficial relationship. And it is of concern. Going back to the question of North Korea, talking to the State Department, they do talk about how they were pleased with some of the conversations that Russia had with North Korea when they met. Perhaps China could do more and the same as their Russian counterparts did. Where this goes, I think we have to be concerned about, because it really is a relationship that is designed to buffer, to box out the United States in a region where paper diplomacy won't work, as I mentioned. And so we can't let that happen, and that's why our presence in a free and open Indo-Pacific matters now more than ever.
Sir, thanks for coming this morning. Brendan Mulvaney from the China Aerospace Studies Institute. I wondered if you could speak for just a little bit about what Congress is doing to engage with both American companies and then our allies or partners abroad to make sure that they're taking into consideration things that you just talked about and not focusing on just a short-term shareholder gain, but actually long-term investment in strategic interests.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when I visit overseas, I always try to get a good understanding of the American business community, meeting with financial voices, meeting with economic voices, meeting with Colorado companies that do business in Asia or around the globe to understand what they're facing. And I'll share with you the story of my first visit in 2015 as chairman of the East Asia Subcommittee. I remember meeting with a group of businesses who were waiting for some reforms to be made by President Xi. They were anticipating that perhaps there was a little bit of a rocky start, but maybe more of a misunderstanding, that this was just kind of the initial stages to a reformer. And this kind of policy on maybe it was the banking legislation, or maybe there were some privacy discussions taking place, but they really weren't the direction that Xi was going to take. They were just an initial step forward as he built the base to make reforms. We heard the same thing in Hong Kong, visiting with even some civil society leaders who were leaving the benefit of the doubt for President Xi. Fast forward a year later, maybe 6 months later, not even a year, and the very same businesses I met with in Asia, I was now meeting with in Washington, and their story had changed dramatically. The story was, we need help. We need help on intellectual property. We need help on the forced transfer of technology. It has to stop. The banking legislation that we talked about is now allowing a back door into our companies' makeup and order. And the same thing we heard, of course, and have seen and witnessed now in Hong Kong. And so Congress has recognized this, and that's why we see passage of things like the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act. That's why we've seen legislation like the BUILD Act and other efforts to make sure that we are bolstering the U.S. business interests. But I think it's important when it comes to some of the values discussions that we also highlight to American businesses supply chain concerns in places like Xinjiang, and that we talk about what's happening with the Uyghur population in China, and that State Department testimony, we hear the number 1 million thrown around, but we actually had testimony from a State Department witness who said there may be as many as 2 million in these political concentration camps that we have seen in China. And so reminding businesses that that is a value that should be shared and is of great interest to the American consumer and the consumers around the globe to know whether or not their supply chain is made up of people who are into forced labor and re-education camps, so to speak. So that kind of pressure from Congress must exist as well in businesses. So we must help, we must open, we should promote trade, fair trade, but we also have to make sure that our values shine through it all.
So here.
Thank you, Senator. My name is Jeannie Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. Would you discuss the situation in the East and South China Sea, the role of Vietnam and ASEAN? Vietnam will be the chair of ASEAN next year, and the current tension in the South China Sea between the Philippines fishing vessel and China, and also Vietnam. The chairman of the Vietnam Communist Party is coming in July. Would the Senate have a plan to have him come and present? And then would you put forth the American values that is very important for us in the Indo-Pacific, especially in the South China Sea? Thank you.
And thank you very much for the question. I have had a number of great conversations with my counterparts in Vietnam, including visiting Vietnam last year. And I was in Vietnam shortly after the USS Vincent had made a port call in Vietnam. And you can sense the excitement in the country from this visit. And I have encouraged Secretary Shanahan and our PACOM, Indo-PACOM leaders to continue increasing the number of calls that we have in Vietnam, particularly with carriers. And I hope that that is something that we will see. There's great opportunity in Vietnam. From a business standpoint, from a security standpoint, the United States has continued to provide supplies and Coast Guard cutters to Vietnam. We've established additional maritime domain awareness efforts with Vietnam. The Asia Reassurance Initiative Act spends a great deal of time and attention dealing with Vietnam and other countries in the area to help bolster military security efforts, as well as maritime domain awareness efforts, helping them uphold the rule of law, international rule of law, particularly as it relates to some of the concern with the island building, the militarization of these features by China. We had a witness testify before my subcommittee here about 2 months ago, Oriana Masto from AEI testified and talked about concern that perhaps Vietnam will be the first instance where China tries to deploy actual kinetic action to test its command structure and some of the changes they have made. So I think there's growing concern that China will take some kind of action against Vietnam, perhaps on one of the disputed areas. The United States must continue to demand that international law be upheld, that disputes be resolved peacefully and in accordance with international law. As it relates to so there's great opportunity in Vietnam. We must continue them, must pursue them. And there's 1,000 years of history with China and Vietnam. And the United States has a lot of history that we can continue to define and make with Vietnam that will and is positive. As it relates to the Philippines, I think, I have visited with leadership in the Philippines, including Foreign Minister Cayetano and others. China has been very active in the Philippines, but certainly the Philippines is well aware of China's intentions, that it is for and about China. And in the words of their leadership, the West Philippine Sea, they will continue to stand up for it. I hope they will stand up louder for their action they took at The Hague in the tribunal that showed the violation of international law. But I think they're well aware of what's happening on the drug front and some other issues that China has posed, the challenge that China has posed without actually addressing them. And so I think you'll see pressures on that relationship increase more and more as we continue to do the right thing, and that is to show presence, to show engagement. The work that we did with the terrorism threat and the situation in the Philippines here over the past year showed really that the United States is a committed ally and friend of the Philippines.
Thank you, Senator. Chia Cheng with United Daily News Group Taiwan. So Wall Street Journal reported that some of the officials from the Trump administration worry that selling tanks and other defense articles to Taiwan may impact the U.S.-China trade negotiation. Would you urge President Trump and his administration not to consider China when selling defense articles to Taiwan? Thank you.
Well, look, it is the law. The Taiwan Relations Act, the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, all point toward the need for the United States to continue to sell defense security articles to Taiwan. It's the right thing to do, and I hope that we will, if I could make up a word here, regularize and routinize these arms sales. What happens, I think, too often is we delay 5, 6, 7 years and a sale to Taiwan, which allows politics to play an ever-increasing role, and the voice of China gets louder and louder, and they raise more and more noise about the sale, which then worries people about the politics of it, and it makes the news. I think we should regularize this. I think this should happen every 2 years, maybe even more frequently. You do that, it deflates the politics, it takes the air out of the political attacks. And I think is a comfort that Taiwan will have with an ever-increasing threat. You know, when you're in Taipei and you see the vibrancy of the people, the economy, the democracy there, knowing the immense threat that they are undergoing, it is our obligation to stand up to those voices like China who would say no, and make sure that we're doing this regularly, not just every 5, 6 years.
Okay, so there, you still have a little more discussion there.
Oh, just one more, he said. One more.
Okay, there we go. Then there,
Thank you. I'm Satoshi Nishida, the Washington correspondent for the Liberty magazine. In the U.S. military's recent Indo-Pacific strategy paper, Taiwan was called a country, clearly. It's published by Department of Defense on June 1st. I think it's epoch-making. So do you think the Congress will support Taiwan as an independent country, or rather will keep it a status quo? Thank you.
Well, the United States' relationship with Taiwan is, of course, governed by the Taiwan Relations Act, which this year celebrates its 40th year. We're aware of China's policy as it relates to Taiwan. I just recently congratulated the superintendent of the United States Air Force Academy for allowing the Taiwan flag to be present at the Academy graduation. I think it's important that we continue to encourage Taiwan leadership around the globe. Taiwan has supported World Health Assembly efforts at a way that we hope others will follow. That international participation must increase. The United States should lead the way for Taiwan. We should lead the way for security efforts for Taiwan. We should encourage high-level visits to Taiwan from U.S. cabinet members. And I have suggested that the Speaker of the House invite President Tsai to address a joint session of Congress as a voice of democracy. So our relationship with Taiwan will continue to be governed by the Taiwan Relations Act, but we can certainly do more to promote the voice of Taiwan and the freedoms that Taiwan represents.
here, last question.
Hi, Senator. So I have a quick question about nuclear policy. So for a multitude of reasons, the U.S. has mostly moved past developing nuclear energy, but China certainly has not. It's slated to open a plethora of new plants and surpass American uranium enrichment by 2035. So what is the United States doing to address these concerns, and what do you see? And do you see a future for nuclear energy in the U.S.?
Thank you very much. So on the nuclear, were you talking about nuclear power production you're talking about? Yeah. So look, I think nuclear power production is a critical component and must be a critical component of U.S. energy infrastructure going forward. Both in testimony by various advocates from Secretary Perry to Secretary Moniz under the Obama administration, they all recognize the need for nuclear power being a part of a climate change plan. If you're looking for carbon-free emissions, nuclear has to be a part of the solution and the equation. So we have introduced a bill, Senator Murkowski and I and some of my other colleagues, bipartisan legislation that would really try to promote and jumpstart nuclear development, particularly some of the small module or some of the other ideas around new nuclear thought to encourage the development of nuclear power. And so we have some other legislation going forward, terrorism reinsurance, legislative efforts that need to be renewed in the coming years that will be an important part of nuclear power development. We have uranium policies in the United States that need to be further developed and refined, protecting the U.S. uranium industry as we don't want to rely on overseas uranium resources when it comes to such an important domestic industry. So look, I think we have the initial start of a nuclear policy that is taking place, but it's got to be a flourishing, growing part of the future. Thank you very much.
Listen, this is a true bipartisan leader in the U.S. Senate, and we are so appreciative of that. Thank you so much. Great job.
Thank you very much. So we're going to get set for our first plenary panel. If the speakers for the first plenary session can meet in the back of the room over here, and if you all can bear with us for just a few minutes while we get the stage set. Thank you.
Boy, that was the magic wand.
Yeah, I'm impressed. Good morning. Good morning. Well, welcome to the next event on the agenda, and I'd like to thank and welcome Professor Ann Friedberg from Princeton and also longtime partner with NBR, and Dr. Richard Ellis, who needs no introduction to most of you in the room. So I'd like to begin with a very basic question. I'm a fan of knowing what right looks like. What should U.S.'s strategy, or what should the U.S.'s objective with respect to China be? Open question to both of you.
Well, being a simple-minded person, I would start off with trying to understand the nature of the threat and challenge, and then the nature of the kind of international system in which the challenge exists. And I think Aaron probably is not going to disagree here too much on this, but we have, in a sense, an international system that is now where power is much more dispersed than during the Cold War, or especially immediately after the Cold War. So there is and it's a fast-changing balance of power. So we have a lot of ambiguity in the international system, which means everybody gets nervous, and it's not clear what opportunities are seen by whom. So you've got a very interesting and fluid and potentially volatile international system. And at the same time, in it, the principal new actor, China, rise of China, presents a series of challenges because of its authoritarian structure, its history, its extreme nationalism, its success, its ambition, and so on. And then there are a bunch of other actors, especially Russia, also Japan and others, who matter. So trying to understand this milieu is kind of the first step.
Well, you've asked what I think is really the key question.
Right.
Because you can't have a strategy that deserves the title without being clear about what the objective is. And I think we're actually at a stage now in this discussion where people talk about consensus, the new consensus on China. And I think that's premature. I think we have a consensus on the existence of a problem and a challenge, but we're far from a consensus on the strategy, prescription for the strategy. I believe that we've had a reasonably coherent strategy going back, let's say, to the end of the Cold War. It probably extends a little bit further back. And it's been a two-pronged approach. We've sought to engage with China across all domains, in particular in the economic domain, but we've also, certainly since the mid-1990s, taken steps to maintain a favorable balance of power in the Asia-Pacific region, maintaining our forces, working with our allies, developing partnerships with other countries, and so on. And it seems to me the objective of that strategy was to maintain stability, to deter aggression or attempts at coercion, while we waited for engagement to kind of work its magic on China. And we were hoping that this process would encourage them to become what in the Bush administration we referred to as a responsible stakeholder in the existing international system. And also that over time, engagement, particularly economic engagement, would set in motion or accelerate forces within China that would lead to the liberalization of its economic system and ultimately the liberalization of its political system. And I think where we are now is at a point where most people will acknowledge that that strategy has not succeeded in achieving its objectives. And so we're kind of back to square one, at least in my view. And I think for the near term, our objectives are probably going to be largely defensive, that in light of the increasing assertiveness or aggression of the current CCP regime, we're going to have to do more, not only to defend our friends and allies and our access to the region and the freedom of navigation through the global commons and so on, so the sort of outer perimeter of our position in the world, but also defending our economy and our society from penetration and exploitation. So in the near term, our objectives are defensive. But in the longer run, I think there is a fundamental question about whether we can hope to have a stable, cooperative relationship with a China that is ruled as China is today by a one-party authoritarian regime. My view is that the answer to that question is no, and that in the long run, we have to, Senator Gardner quoted George Kennan. Kennan also said at the end of his long Telegram X article that the long-term objective of U.S. strategy had to be to await the gradual mellowing or eventual breakup of Soviet power. And I would substitute CCP power. But I think in the long run, that has to be our objective.
You know, we really have two sets of goals simultaneously. One of them simply refers to the bases of power, paying attention to our own economic power, the economic power of like-minded states. So balancing China in particular and Russia as well, there have to be a group of states unavoidably led by the United States who have to pay attention to their sheer capabilities. So part of the competition is a competition between capabilities. The other part of the competition is engagement, trying to be influential and so on, diplomatic, ideological, military, and so on. But we have to understand that at this juncture, there are reasons we have to pay attention to the sheer capacity of our military forces, economic might, forming relationships around China, which together forge a better balance than would otherwise be the case. So they're kind of twin goals with regard to policy.
So in this context, do you think China can be influenced? I mean, we've seen they've sort of opened up their markets. What type of influence might they be susceptible to?
Well, I think to the extent that they've reformed and opened, as Deng Xiaoping said they would, going back to the late 1970s, they've done so largely on their own terms and for their own reasons. the CCP leadership, I think particularly after Tiananmen in 1989, was determined both to proceed with economic reform and opening within certain parameters, and also to forestall any possibility of meaningful political reform. I think that that was always accurately perceived in the West, in the United States. There was an expectation that this was a little bit of a hiccup, perhaps, but that inevitably China would move down a path that would lead us closer and closer together in terms of composition and character of our domestic political systems. So yes, they've reformed and they've changed, but on their own terms and for their own reasons, and always with the eye to maintaining the monopoly on domestic political
So it wasn't
power
so
from
much
Chinese
they were influenced, this was their own pursuit of.
Yes,
their
I
own
wouldn't say there
objectives.
was no influence. I think at this point, the hope that we can kind of encourage the current Chinese leadership to pursue policies more in keeping with those that we would prefer by offering inducements, by being nice, essentially, is an empty one. I do think we can influence the behavior of the CCP regime in part by demonstrating the ineffectiveness of the tactics that it's pursuing. And that has to be the first order of business, to prevent them from succeeding in achieving some of the objectives they're pursuing at this point, as in the hopes that in the longer run that might deflect them.
Yeah, I would add to that that there are probably some areas, not unlike we found during the Cold War, where there can be strategic cooperation. In the Cold War, we even managed to put together, at the very height of the Cold War, in the immediate aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Test Ban Treaty. It was in the U.S., at the time, is how it started, U.S., UK's, and America's interest to stop atmospheric tests, prevent underwater tests, and so on. But that's very limited. That was a global interest that they all shared from the danger of fallout. In the case to understand, I think, the limits to strategic cooperation at this point, you have to understand the existential threat that democracies, and especially the American democracy, because we're the powerful one, pose to China. These are incompatible. Our system and set of values are incompatible with theirs. So regardless of what we do, there's going to be an intense existential competition as long as that regime remains as it is. So therefore, there's going to be tremendous insecurity on their part, tremendous sensitivity. So that translates to competition, especially given their ambitions and so on, around the world.
So the success of a government to achieve its strategic objectives is correlated with its ability to marshal the country's resources in pursuit of those objectives. Can you talk a little bit about U.S. strategy in doing that towards, in pursuit of objectives with China, and how China marshals its resources?
Well, first on China, clearly because it's not a democratic system, it's an autocratic or authoritarian regime where the party state ultimately has all power, it's an easier proposition to demand that various actors in society accord with the wishes of the regime to mobilize resources, to extract resources for strategic purposes. So at least in the near to medium term, that's an advantage. There are disadvantages that that kind of centralized regime has, and we've seen those in competition with centralized regimes in the past. On our side, historically, the United States has done well at mobilizing resources for strategic competition only after it's experienced some kind of setback or crisis. And that's because our system is not designed for purposes of mass mobilization.
Right.
We don't have a strong state. We have a relatively weak one. We have divided government. We have all kinds of ways in which different interest groups can influence policy and so on. And for the most part, in peacetime, in normal peacetime, that's the way we proceed. Unfortunately, it has usually taken some kind of setback to galvanize our system, to achieve a true consensus about the existence of the threat. And when that happens, Our system is designed actually to allow a great deal of mobilization and focus. Once the Congress and the executive and the judiciary and press and public opinion come into greater alignment, it's possible to do a lot. Short of that, there are real limitations on how effectively we can compete. And I think the question going forward as we think about competition with China is how we can get closer to the level of preparedness and competition that I think we're going to need to achieve, forestalling a crisis, we hope. So in the absence of some kind of shock, I think that's where we are. And that's going to require political leadership. Yep. That's the only way to do that.
That's right. You know, if you compare this, just to underscore Aaron's point, if you compare this era with the 1930s, there are a number of similarities, still economic insecurity, all kinds of engagement with authoritarian systems and ambivalence about them in spite of the gathering terrible news coming out of Europe and Asia. Tremendous ambivalence in the United States about the whole business and about our role in the world and so on. Things that we hear in today so much of. And it took this horrible set of shocks to get us going. And in that slower paced world, we had the time. We also had an industrial sector that dominated the world. Today, our industrial sector is outsized by China's by 1.5 to twice in terms of comparative, just sheer size. And arguably, China's economy in many ways is more vertically integrated than ours, much like ours was in the 1930s, in fact. So on the one hand, you can see that we haven't reached sufficient consensus and sense of alarm to do a whole bunch. At the same time, we may not have the same capacity, which will give us the will, in fact, to engage like we did in 1941. So it's our hope, in fact, in events like this and all the work we're doing, that the American public and policymakers can understand just the gravity of the challenges we face and begin earlier on and not have to face the huge crisis because that crisis may come too late. We may not have the chance to respond. You'd rather forestall the events as they unfolded in the mid-20th century.
Yeah, clearly when the U.S. public and lawmakers become motivated, the U.S. can mobilize very well, but we haven't reached that public and political consensus yet.
I believe that's the case, although it is striking how much attitudes have changed, particularly in this city, on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats. I think there are any number of Democratic senators who would have given a very similar set of remarks this morning. And that would not have been true 5 or 10 years ago. Yeah. So there's been a lot of, in my view, progress towards a better understanding, at least of the existence of this challenge.
So let me ask you maybe an unfair question. Over the next 5 years, what would you like to see in terms of a change in this country to put us in a better standing?
Well, that could be a long list.
What would allay some of your fears and concerns and start mitigating risks?
Rich, I'm going to let you take that first, since you're the senior statesman.
So, for example, there is a national effort to try to support the development of AI. Mm-hmm. Is that a step in the right direction?
Okay, well, let me take a stab at it, because this is the most comprehensive challenge America has faced since probably the early 19th century, when we were sacked and burned here by the preeminent world power at the time, Great Britain. But this is truly a remarkable set of challenges, and given the complexity of international affairs, it's comprehensive. So you can't separate out economic, diplomatic, military, and so on. It's going to take an absolutely comprehensive set of integrated strategies. And that means, for example, on the economic front, and Senator Gardner began to touch on this, That means trying to understand how we bolster and boost our economic might together with our allies and friends, which will give them greater heart and a belief that they should be in our coalition, but to boost our capacity, our economic growth, and so on. Now that means it's going to take positive steps in a strategy. It means negative steps. It means, because of the danger of supply chains going into China, it means having to disentangle them, to better secure them, to look for alternative sources of supply. So there's an entire economic dimension of this, while you want to sustain a vigorous market system, which is going to outdo them. Very complicated. So at the same time, you're having to keep your powder dry, and that doesn't mean just sustaining, increasing our O&M budget, right? It means making major innovations and supplying major research, R&D, as well as new kinds of programs relevant to the kinds of threats, big power threats we're facing. And then diplomatically, in my view, maybe we can get there, it means handling those powers that most want us to fail, handling them in a very adroit, strategic way that encourages them not to work together, encourages at least one of them maybe to begin to understand its interests are mostly in siding with us.
Disentangling, I'm going to pull the thread on the thought of disentangling U.S. and Chinese economies and reversing our economic interdependence. That's a big thought. That's a huge thought. Is that really necessary? And to what extent?
If I could just take a stab at the previous question for a second. Because I agree with everything that Rich has said. I think, among other things, it's likely that we're going to have to sustain substantial increases in defense spending over a long period of time. So under the current administration, there's been an increase, but it's going to be very difficult to sustain it unless and until we have some kind of broad consensus about our fiscal policies, taxation, spending, entitlement spending. I mean, this is big. People talk about all of society and so on. Well, we have to come to some kind of resolution of those difficulties if we're going to be able to mobilize the necessary resources to engage in a long-term competition with a country like China with a large and still quite fast-growing economy. So that's one thing. Rich mentioned the defensive measures that we have to take because of the vulnerabilities that are created by the entanglement of our economies, and that's a big topic that we can come to in a minute. Just on the innovation front, there are both defensive measures we have to take to protect intellectual property, to reduce the extent to which Chinese entities have been able to penetrate and extract intellectual property from American and other Western companies. This is a process that's now seriously in gear. But I think most people would also agree there are things we have to do domestically in terms of our own policies in order to sustain the flexibility and the innovative qualities of our economy, including, and this is the sort of eat your spinach list, increased federal spending on basic scientific research and development, which has dropped off, improvements in K through 12 education, including in science and math, immigration policies that continue to attract people of ability to want to come to this country and become citizens and live and work here. So there's an array of things that we need to do. I think in our both in the ways that our political leaders talk about this challenge domestically and in the way we talk about it internationally, there has to be a greater emphasis than I think there has been to this point on this issue of values. And the point being that we have a system based on what we consider to be universal values, not American values, but universal values, that many others share our belief in the importance of those values, political liberty, religious freedom, and so on, and that we have to defend those. That, I think, is ultimately what is necessary to mobilize our people, and I think it's also essential to holding together a coalition to oppose a regime that denies the existence of those universal values and seeks to the extent that it can to weaken them. So there are many things that we need to do. Disentangling, should we talk about that? That's our
Why
favorite
not?
topic.
Yes, it's a huge, I mean, I'm an economist by training, right? So that's a huge, I don't even know if it's possible. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, let me take a first stab at it. I've been dealing more or less in many ways with this issue since graduate school. In the 1970s, there was a lot of concern about the hollowing out of the United States economy, and at the same time we were in strategic competition with the Soviet Union, and so there were export controls and so on. We had CFIUS, we had investment controls, but they were comparatively of minor importance given the limited capacities of the Soviet Union. But export controls were a big deal, and failures in them, such as in the early 1980s, the Toshiba Kongsberg example and so on, they really did make the headlines. Well, today, given the international economy, the complexity and the interdependence, the idea that we're going to rely solely on export controls, CFIUS, and bureaucratic means of attempting to keep intellectual property from illicitly getting to China, wow, this is a big, tall order. It's almost it's incomprehensible, in fact, to me, given the failures in a much simpler era, that in this era we could even, by bureaucratic means alone, have any chance of stemming this. And yet, it's clear we have to do enormous things. Our supply chains are beyond vulnerable. To sustain a military effort, say it was kept even at a moderate level in Asia, with China clamping down, would be unimaginable. I mean, it's just, so what do? You can do a combination of things, and it's interesting. One of the things that we do at MBR, and I do personally, is serve to direct something called the IP Commission, the Commission on the Theft of American Intellectual Property. It's been highly effective in publicizing the degree of problem that we have in intellectual property theft and transfer. So we're looking for innovative ways in dealing with this complex world. One of the ways would be to try to introduce market mechanisms into this. A scoring kind of mechanism, which, like a FICO score, all economic entities in the world would hold a score based on how they have behaved in terms of protecting intellectual property and so on. And thus that kind of score would incentivize actors worldwide to work more with this one versus that one and so on, and maybe encourage change. But at the same time, boy, what a difficult thing to do. One last comment, and that is on tariffs. There is nothing like a sledgehammer to get people's attention. And the sledgehammer is actually way too precise an instrument for an analogy. This is, I always like to say things, close only counts in horseshoes and atom bombs. This is kind of like an atom bomb. Lots of, stuff going on and repercussions all over the place. But I'll have to say this. One thing about the tariffs is that they have absolutely riveted everybody's attention on the degree to which China is a problem. And it's primarily China. China accounts for between 80 and 90% of IP theft worldwide. That alone, and then, underlying that, this tremendous strategic competition. And pretty soon, investors, business people begin to realize, this is a tough long-term bet. We better diversify our risk. And so I would argue that a little blunt instrument and some of the has been useful. And so we're going to see in a process perhaps already begun now, the redirecting of supply chains and a kind of reorientation in the global economy.
Well, Rich has done a little plugging for NBR, and I'll do a little bit more. First, I think the IP Commission has been extremely important. It's really one of the first efforts to call attention to the extent of Chinese theft of intellectual property going back, what, to 2013 or 2012?
That's right, yeah.
So it's now recognized, I think, as having been a path-breaking effort and continues. Another somewhat more modest effort is underway that I'm currently co-chairing with Congressman Charles Bustani, re-examining the economic dimension of U.S. strategy towards China. We issued a first report in January, and we have a second one that's going to come out early in the fall. And of course, it's a huge problem, an ongoing conversation and debate. One of the challenges of doing a report on this topic over the last 18 months has been that it keeps moving and keeps changing, and policy keeps changing from day to day, so it's not been easy to stay ahead of that. So just a couple of comments on it. It really goes back to the point I was making earlier about the assumptions that underlay our policy towards China going back to the early 1990s, this idea of incorporating China into the global system and in particular into the international economy in the expectation that that would induce change over time, economic and political. What that allowed was the development of an extraordinary degree of interconnectedness, because that coincided with this larger trend towards globalization and the distribution of production networks and freer flows of information and investment and so on. And that was something that was recognized as being important by American policymakers. It was also something that was seen in the long run to be advantageous to the United States, both in economic and strategic terms, because it would contribute to this process that would produce liberalization in China and alleviate any strategic concern we might have. So we tried to treat China as a normal trading partner and opened ourselves up in the process to some forms of interconnectedness, which we now recognize as carrying significant risk. There's a tendency, I think, on the part of some of my economist friends, no offense to economists, to say, well, this was an act of God, and it's just a natural result of the working out of economic forces. But that's not really true. It's the result of markets and structures that were set in place by strategic decisions made both in the United States and in China in the early part of the 1990s. And it can change if those strategic calculations change. And that, I think, is what's starting to happen now. This is not to say that it's going to be easy to achieve a degree of separation or disentanglement, which we would regard as, I think, necessary for our own security, or that it's going to be cheap to do that. I think it's going to be costly in certain respects to do that. We're just at the beginning of thinking about what the objectives of that process ought to be. But I do think there's a recognition that there are risks that we probably should not be running if we allow, for example, key components of our IT infrastructure or key components of weapons and other defense-related systems to be manufactured in facilities that are owned or controlled by Chinese entities, all of which I think we now recognize are ultimately controlled by the CCP.
Yeah.
There were cost advantages to allowing much of this to happen, but that discounted the strategic risk, or something which I think is in certain respects clearer and where the discussion has proceeded further, the idea that we probably shouldn't and won't run the risks associated with allowing Chinese entities to build or control significant portions of our critical infrastructure. We were well down the road of allowing that to happen before people started to recognize what the dangers were. Technology transfer, or extraction, the idea that we really didn't mind and shouldn't be worried if Chinese entities, again, with perhaps by one step removed or not even one step removed, links to the party state, investing in American companies that were developing technologies that are potentially of strategic importance, economic, but also military. That too is a process that had advanced quite a long way before people started to recognize that it was undesirable. So we're at the early stages of this. It's going to be messy. It's going to be costly, but I think it's necessary.
So based on your answer, one would think that maybe we would prioritize sort of high-tech products. But given the Internet of Things and how there's so many dual-use products out there, that might be harder said than done.
It undoubtedly will be harder than to do than to say. On the other hand, that's the direction in which things are already moving.
Yeah.
And it's worth noting, I think, that if there is going to be a process of disentanglement or disengagement, which I think to some degree there is, it's really a process that was set in motion by the Chinese, not by us.
Oh, interesting.
So China has been imposing restrictions on investment in certain sectors of its economy. They've been trying to pull back and increase their own self-reliance in the development and production of components that go into their systems. So they're well down this road already, although they're not far enough down it that they are independent of us. Some people have described a possible new equilibrium in which we engaged in trade in things that were not of any obvious strategic relevance. So Dan Rosen, a friend of mine, says, well, it's socks and soybeans.
Yeah.
You know, we can buy all the socks we want from China or other consumer products, and we'll sell them all the soybeans they want, but we're not going to be doing the same kind of production, distributed production and trade in high-tech sectors. Again, that's easier to say than to figure out how you're going to do it, or to imagine the political circumstances that would allow that to go forward. I mean, the question in my mind is whether there's an equilibrium point between the kind of status quo, which is our being essentially open and China being in certain respects increasingly closed, and a world in which we're both closed off, a real sort of Cold War separation between our economies in every respect. What's the point between those of our strategic and economic interests? Because I think the status quo, it has been very desirable to the Chinese regime, and they would like to keep it that way if they could.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah, just Aaron and Charles have really done a deep dive looking at the issue comprehensively, and had really been interviewing across the board so many premier people, different segments of this. Let me just underscore one really important point for everyone to understand. The Chinese, in spite of I think popular understanding, have had a remarkably consistent set of industrial policies through all these various leaders. And there's so much attention pointed to Xi Jinping. But in fact, he's just done a more sophisticated and better job than some of his predecessors, and in some ways, not as good a job. The effort to steal American secrets commenced the day of Sino-US rapprochement in the face of the Soviet threat. And by the end of the 1970s, they had already successfully, by being invited into our labs, talking to our physicists, our military people, and so on, by the end of the 70s, they had stole the technology to produce enhanced radiation weapons, neutron bomb. They had our most advanced nuclear secrets by 1979. And by 1978-9, Deng Xiaoping's reforms began, and those 4 categories of reforms, including military modernization, by the way, those reforms were aimed at taking that lesson from the 70s and expanding it across the board economically through their students coming here, through strategic trade, taking on production and so on, and integrating themselves, not for the purpose of some joyous, market-driven kumbaya in which we all, rise our boats together, but no, for the strategic purposes of the party state, which was to enhance its own power, the country's power, and as Xi Jinping likes to call it now, achieve the China dream, which is no less than the reestablishment of the Central Kingdom as the major power in the world, and a system of international relations based on the Chinese model, which I think we need to look at probably as if we're trying to anticipate a hybrid of a kind of Leninist, international Leninist model led by China and its historic suzerain role. So we're talking about a hierarchy of states, not a global market-driven kumbaya.
I just want to highlight something that Rich said about, which I think is very important, about the consistency over a long period of time, I believe, in Chinese policy or CCP policy and objectives. There's been some tendency in the last several years for people to blame everything on Xi Jinping and say if only he hadn't come along and sort of yanked the wheel sharply in the wrong direction, everything would be proceeding swimmingly. I think that's just fundamentally wrong. It's wrong on the fact, but it also creates a misleading impression, I think, which is if only we can outweight this guy, and someone else will come along, someone nicer will come along, who will pursue different policies, everything will be okay. That's not going to happen. Xi Jinping, as Rich says, has been more aggressive, more open in certain respects in stating China's objectives, pushed harder along various axes where his predecessors were already pushing. I think he's done that in part because of what may turn out to be, in retrospect, an excessive confidence in the relative power of China and the United States, and a belief that the moment had come when it was possible for China to move ahead very rapidly. I think history may judge that this was premature, and that actually many of the things that have happened in the last several years, not only in this country, but in other parts of the world, including Europe, where people have begun to become more suspicious and concerned about Chinese activity, are a direct result of that acceleration. But it's an acceleration down.
But as someone familiar, especially on this stage, but around the room, Nadej Roland has pointed out, Belt and Road is really Chinese foreign policy. It's bringing together economic, strategic, diplomatic, all the tools for the extension of Chinese influence, and much of it with a long-term view, which is just fascinating. Can you make a particular region increasingly integrated through its infrastructure and its economy, dependent upon its relationship with China? And so money-wise, and as I said, infrastructure, trade relations, security relations, and so it's global. I'm fascinated that it never makes the papers, but a couple of years ago, it was announced a major Chinese oil and gas company proposed to build the big new natural gas pipeline in Alaska. It's not the Belt and Road, and as you probably know, belt means land and road means water, but in any case, it's not that it just goes through Eurasia. It's not that it just goes through Southeast Asia. No, it's a global effort. And how successful might a part of it be were it to complicate the calculations of the congressional delegation of Alaska if $50 billion were coming in, or 60 or more, to build a gas pipeline to a terminal that would then export LNG to China. So it's a global phenomenon. And we have to understand that it is really part of it, a comprehensive strategy. As Aaron said, there are elements even within China that surfaced some months ago in which a lot of this stuff, the expense of it, the world's negative reaction to it, a lot of this stuff is coming now apparent in domestic Chinese affairs, has in fact Xi Jinping overstepped or overplayed his hand, and too early. Did not attend enough to biding his time in Deng Xiaoping's terminology. But this is a global phenomenon. It's not just regional. It is foreign policy. It is a comprehensive strategic effort. It's not just a Marshall Plan. It's much bigger than that, with much longer term, and I would argue insidious implications because you have the permanent insertion of Chinese interests wherever Belt and Road goes.
Well, a little more plugging for NBR work. Rich mentioned Nadezhda's book, which I strongly recommend, China's Eurasian Century, which was ahead of the curve in identifying the roots of this looked at from a Chinese perspective. I agree with what Rich has said. This is clearly a strategic effort on the part of China to expand its influence, to extend its reach, to enhance its interests in various ways. It has this continental aspect and also the maritime dimension, but it can also be divided up other ways. There's a part of it that's clearly directed at other advanced industrial countries, particularly in Europe, and then a large portion of it that's directed to the global south, to the developing world, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, Middle East, to parts of Latin America. And I think in those parts of the world, Belt and Road has become sort of the principal platform for China to advance its interests. And they're varied, and the situation varies in different. Began at the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st. China was principally interested in acquiring resources of various kinds, minerals, especially if, as I think they've anticipated for a while, their access to the market of the United States and other advanced industrial countries may be constrained over time. So Africa, for example, is now slated, projected to grow in population, I think to double by 2050, at 2 billion people. So potentially a very large market, a place where Chinese enterprises could establish productive facilities and take advantage of low-cost labor as Chinese labor costs increase. It's also, I think, a concern that the Chinese SOEs and other entities that are involved in this process seem particularly interested, not just in the usual physical infrastructure, bridges, roads in particular, in building IT networks. And as I think people are increasing, this has substantial strategic implications. It could allow Chinese entities to have access to intelligence information, access to vast quantities of data, which can be used to fuel the development of algorithms for artificial intelligence. It also, the penetration also brings with it the prospect of greater political influence, which I think the Chinese are interested in. They are free to throw money around in a way that Western institutions and firms are generally constricted from doing by their laws. And that's having an effect, I think, of weakening democratic institutions where those may not yet have taken root and strengthening authoritarian regimes. They're looking for support in diplomatic confrontations with the West. Mao had an expression that he introduced during the Civil War, that he was going to encircle the cities from the countryside. And that was also a term that was used to describe some of China's revolutionary activities during the 1960s. And I gather that that term is now being used by some people in China to describe the long-term purpose of China's activities in the developing world, to influence and presence. So it's a big, big game. Whether it's going to play out in the ways that China's leaders might hope is a question. And as Rich mentions, there's been pushback against it in various parts of the world, growing dissatisfaction or unhappiness.
Are some of these ones predatory, for example?
Right, that's one part of the question. I guess the last thing to say about it, though, is a lot of the commentary, even now, I think in the United States and in the West, assesses what the Chinese are doing with reference to standards that are probably not applicable, sort of cost-benefit calculation. And this has led people to conclude that this is sort of foolish and they're wasting money and this pipeline will never pay off and so on. Well, in fact, it's quite possible, I think it's likely, that from the perspective of China's decision makers, some of these investments are a form of, if they're a strategic investment, they're a form of insurance. So they're willing to pay a premium to build a pipeline that will bring natural gas across land because they fear that in a conflict, the United States might interdict supplies that come by sea. So we have to try to understand what their motivations are rather than projecting our own standards onto what they're doing.
Following on the topic of China's influence on other countries, do you believe that there are countries like Singapore, for example, who feel pressured to pick sides?
Everybody's feeling pressured to pick sides. I mean, you have, it's interesting, if you look at the structure of international relations today, there's a re-emerging bipolarization. You've got two poles, basically, the United States and China. You have this strategic competition, which is being clarified now in everybody's minds around the world. If you're a Vietnam or a Philippines or a Malaysia or wherever you are, particularly around the periphery, but even away from the periphery, you're going to see your interests not lined up maybe as clearly as they were some years ago when there wasn't the pull, both the pull of China and also the effective nascent threat from China. Nascent threat may mean if you can't deal with it in any other way, you're going to bandwagon. So in the case of all these countries, a smaller country has to make a really tough set of calculations, economic, political, diplomatic, military, as to how it's going to play this game. And in an ever-changing balance of power, this is very fluid, in which Chinese capability increasingly puts at risk our forces in the Western Pacific, then you're going to, if you're the Philippines or wherever you are, you're going to have to think, wow, I need to engage both sides. I'm not sure who the winner is going to be. I sure wish America, we loved how it was. We could kind of do whatever we wanted, engage, whatever. We had a lot of freedom here. It's not that comfortable anymore. China's going to have some demands, but we can't ignore them. And so in every case, it's amazing how many places are now in play that wasn't the case just a few years ago. Some places are not in play, like Japan. Japan understands its interests closely with the United States as clearly as anybody. But it's amazing how many places are in play. And it's not that we're not putting some places in play that we wouldn't have imagined to just a few years ago. North Korea, for example. So North Korea is potentially in play, not because American power is increasing in the region, which gives North Korea increasing incentive to try to deal with us, and or increasing incentive to side with China. If you look from North Korea's perspective, its principal threat, historically and now, is not South Korea. South Korea is not going to invade the North, and it knows it. It's not Japan. Japan's the last country in the world to go on the mainland of Asia, invade somebody. They can do all, they've proven, the North, humiliate us, kill our troops, rattle their sword, blow up nuclear weapons. All we do is seem to get mad, but we don't do anything. Their principal threat is China. So our reaching out to North Korea is based on the fact that North Korea's principal threat is from the North, not from the South or from us. Now, China is acutely aware of this. And so China has summoned Kim Il-jung to come to Beijing time after time. Xi Jinping is going to go to Pyongyang apparently shortly. So China is acutely aware that it can't afford to have North Korea in play. So my point is that really everywhere in the world is really potentially not unlike in the Cold War, although there were rigid alliances and so on, but the Soviet Union often thought parts of Western Europe were in play. Like that, we're seeing in a bipolar world through all over the place, nations in play. It's a global competition.
We used to focus very much on the Asia-Pacific region and be concerned about the disposition of countries there, and that's still a concern. But as Rich suggests, this is now blossomed and expanded and is truly global. A couple of things on this issue of choosing sides. I think the United States, until very recently, was not pushing anyone to take sides. I think our position, again, looking at the Asia-Pacific region, was go ahead and have your economic relationship with China. You can have that as well as having a close security relationship with us, Australia as an example. It was the Chinese, the CCP regime, that was saying, you can't expect in the long run to enjoy the great benefits that you gain from your economic relationship with us if you continue to side with the United States. And the Chinese were the ones who were suggesting this, and they still are, and they're doing it, I think, more openly. More recently, I think the United States, at least in particular cases, and especially in the technology domain, has been saying to partner countries, including some of our closest allies, you have to make some choices about whether you're going to allow Huawei to build portions of your critical infrastructure. And if you do, there may be negative implications for your relationship with us. That's a rather new development. I think the U.S., what the U.S. has offered many countries, particularly in the region, but not only there, has been a mix of security assurances and also economic opportunities. And we have to double down on both. I think we have to make certain that people believe that our security guarantees are credible. And that what Senator Gardner said earlier is true, that the United States isn't going to be pushed out of the region and is, by virtue of geography and history, an Indo-Pacific power and so on. That's a message that has to be reiterated, because one of the things that Chinese interlocutors say to their counterparts in Asia is, the Americans are not here forever. We are. You have to deal with us. You better be careful about getting on our bad side. So we need to reinforce the credibility of our security commitments. But we also have to make sure that we provide the greatest possible opportunity for others who are being drawn closer to China because of the gravitational pull of its massive economy to benefit from continued economic interaction with us. And if we're threatening or imposing tariffs on our friends and allies, I think we're doing exactly the opposite. I think we would have been wiser to proceed with TPP, for example. That's now a dead horse that we can beat endlessly. Because if we don't, whatever the economic implications of those kinds of agreements may be, we are contributing to China's efforts to essentially to draw others closer and closer to it. That is an inevitable, and I don't think many of the countries in the world or in Asia in particular want to be in that sphere exclusively, but we have to make sure that they have options.
You know, let me bring this back to the National Asia Research Program. As in the Cold War, and again, I think even more so today, we have to understand the interests, kind of the strategic position and interests of an amazing number of actors in between the U.S. and China. Although, if you look at a map, it doesn't look like they're in between, but in fact, it's in this periphery. We have to understand the interests, motivations, interdependencies, histories, and so on of an incredible number of states that in the end could be extremely strategically important in this competition. So understanding many Southeast Asian nations, Europeans actually, all around the world, we have to understand these places better than ever. We need new generations of specialists, of area specialists. Area studies declined after the Cold War. The traditional disciplines reasserted themselves, and we need to reinvigorate area studies. We have to understand places again, that actually places are different and peoples are different, their histories are different, because if we're going to be wise in our dealings with countries that matter now in this big game that we're playing, we got to know them better. So hence the need to nurture new generations of area specialists.
I agree with that. As a practicing political scientist, I can confirm that this is a major and ongoing issue, and the thought that everybody is not just a rational actor with one substitutable for another is a shocking insight for some people, but really shouldn't be. I guess the other thing I would say about this effort, I mean, in addition to the analytic and intellectual labor that Rich refers to, which is critically important to conducting an effective strategy, I do think that aside from material interests, security, or welfare, the ideological component is critical, and that the countries that we are going to be closest to in the long run and who are going to feel confident in relying on us and with whom we can cooperate most closely are countries who share with us certain basic values and beliefs. We shouldn't be shy about saying that.
Yeah, well, in fact, in international affairs, it's interesting. In the end, values, in spite of the fact that we have in our minds, we kind of separate out Wilsonian foreign policy versus realpolitik and so on. The reality of international affairs is values are always important. And once again, they're simply paramount. We would not be nearly as concerned. Are today the voices of human rights organizations, for example, would not be heard were China a democratic, rule of law-based society, magnificently successful. We couldn't mobilize very many Americans over that. But in fact, there are fundamental values that are simply critical to our lives that are at stake. And so understanding that and understanding at the same time authoritarians' paranoia about freedom, democratic values, rule of law, all the things that they don't have and don't stand for, their sensitivity to it means the competition is going to happen. They've been at war with us. It was a great comment I heard one time in the White House. It was, you know, if somebody's at war with you, you're at war with them. You may not realize it, but, you know, you're at war with them. And this is a set of actors overseas that have been quietly at war with us for a long time, trying to beat us and trying to supplant their values for ours, trying to protect their own, their vulnerable. Right. So in any case, I can't underscore that enough.
Yes, this is another shocking insight that I should highlight for political scientists. Not all nations are the same. They're not all billiard balls that interact in similar ways or predictable ways under the same circumstances.
And have different objective functions.
Right. Their domestic orders, their political structures matter tremendously in the ways that they behave in international relations.
All right. My last question. The thought of an alliance between China and Russia, I think, is terrifying to most. What should the United States do to make such an alliance a lower probability?
Okay, well, this is, I'll plug one more NBR book, why not? Bob Sutter and I, Bob led a multi-year project that looked at the Sino-Russian alignment. We had 50 papers written, a whole bunch of great meetings. I mean, over 100 top specialists in the world focused on this. Understanding what drives those two together is fundamental, and we can talk about the complex interests and where their interests might overlap or not. They don't overlap necessarily in Central Asia. They don't overlap necessarily at all in the Russian Far East. But in the main, two overriding interests compel what in essence is an alliance. Not called an alliance, but in essence it is. And the first is, and we've talked about it, is the common threat they feel from democracy in the US in particular. So undermining that threat, which is existential to them, drives them together. Secondly, they have complementary interests. In my view, this is the one that is least understood. Many people poo-poo Russia as having an economy 10% of our own or 10% of China's size. But what compels them to strategically collaborate as much as anything else is that they're complementary interests. Russia covets Europe. Mm-hmm. China covets Asia, the routes to Asia. It has global ambition as well, and that scares Russia. That long-term, the sheer power of China and long-term goals of China are not shared interests with Russia. But, boy, for the interim period, some good long period, they have complementary interests. So they can divide our attention. They can divide our forces. We gave up during the immediate post-Cold War era our capacity to fight 2.1, at least 2 wars in different theaters, a war in each theater. We gave up that capacity. They divide our strategic attention. And so they can see the day when America might falter and Russia could achieve its goals in Europe, China, in Asia. One last part of this, and I want to compare it to the Axis of the 1930s and 40s. Japan's economy, when it attacked the United States, was what percentage of America's economy? It's unimaginable with not that axis and Germany doing what it was doing in Europe. It's unimaginable Japan would have attacked us. But that axis divided our attention. Japan's economy was 10% of ours in 1941. So those who discount a weak Russia as really being an actor of importance don't understand what it means when you can divide the will, the capacity, and so on of the only possible adversary you've really got. No one else can stand up. There's no alternative to the United States. So I would argue that the number one threat to the United States, military threat, security threat, is the potential for our forces to be divided in those theaters when we're not prepared to do so. We are not prepared to fight major wars in Russia, in Europe, and Asia at this time.
On the ideological theme, in contrast to the early stages of the Cold War, where the Soviet Union and the People's Republic purported to be share a common ideological outlook. They're both communist powers and wound up arguing about who should be the leader and who was the best interpreter of doctrine and so on. China and Russia presently don't have that problem. They don't purport to share an ideology in a positive sense, but they share a negative ideology, an anti-ideology. They're both fearful of liberal democracy. And that, I think, may enable this alignment to last longer than if they were arguing over questions of doctrine.
Yeah, well then, and they have gone out of their way to acknowledge the disaster of the Sino-Soviet split. They are explicit about it. We will not repeat that. They say that explicitly because, frankly, looking back, arguably, that's what really undid, that's what enabled us to win, together with some other things, but that was critical to our victory in the Cold War, and they have vowed not to repeat it.
They also have, as Rich suggests, a number of complementary material interests. In addition to the strategic one, China needs resources, and that's one thing that Russia can provide. Russia needs capital, and that's something that China can provide. So I think it's a mistake to believe that this is sort of a passing fancy and that these countries are not truly aligned. I think they are, and they're likely to become more so. In the long run, as Rich also suggests, and many people have pointed out, there are likely to be difficulties. Russia was, for a long time, the big brother, and it is no more. China clearly is, and that's not a comfortable position for the Russians to be in. China, as it pushes to the west along the continental axis of the Belt and Road, is moving directly into areas that the Russians have long thought of as their preferred sphere of influence. They do seem to be finding ways to cooperate even with that, but there are likely to be tensions in the long run. And that's something we should be alert to. I don't think there's any prospect in the near term of our doing anything that would really successfully separate these two countries, because I don't think there's much that we can or should offer either of them that would encourage them to turn their backs on each other. And in particular, with respect to Russia, we're not going to say you can have Ukraine or you can have the Baltic republics. We can't do that. We won't do that. We shouldn't do that. Moreover, I think both the Russian and Chinese regimes, for their own reason, need a degree of tension with the West and with the United States to mobilize their populations. And this is certainly true of Putin in Russia, who's built his whole identity around this. So for the time being, pending some change in the character of the Russian regime, which seems more likely than a change in the character of the Chinese regime, I don't think we should be toying with the idea of doing a sort of reverse of what Kissinger and Nixon did with China in the late 60s and early 70s. I think that's an illusion. We have to be in opposition substantially to both, which, as Rich says, means we have to take seriously the possibility of a variety of scenarios that could be very stressful for us, including military scenarios.
So Aaron and I are not exactly twins, separated at birth. And I'm not as well shaven as he is, but in addition to that, I think there's something we can do. I think there's some things we can do, and that we have to do. Since this is the number 1 threat, that alliance those two operating in different spheres and dispersing the United States strategically. Number 1, it's going to be hard to deter China. It's bigger, stronger, harder to change that party state, harder to deal with it. But Russia is weaker. Russia's interests are, at best, ambivalent with regard to China. And we can deter Russia. If I were president, I wouldn't have had those, hour-long conversations that I know President Obama had with Putin. I'd probably have a 60-second to 90-second one, which is, you're first to go. You're not going to do anything in Europe. I don't care what China's doing in Asia. You're not doing anything in Europe because we're taking you out. So I would deter Russia. I would also hold out carrots down the road. If you pulled your troops back from Eastern Europe, if you did a few things, there are things we will do with you economically. There is a relationship with Japan you could have. You could have a pipeline with Japan. We might be able to do some things. But don't you count on that alliance with China, because we're taking you out first. And so I would focus the clearest deterrence on Russia, and to have it recalculate exactly what its strategic interests are.
Well, since Rich has opened up some daylight between us, I'm gonna pry away at it just a little bit so we can end on a note of dispute and disagreement. I actually don't think we disagree. I just don't believe that there's much prospect for making progress along these lines with the current Russian leadership, because I think they're so heavily invested in their current position of opposition to the West and to the United States. Moreover, I do think we have to differentiate between the challenge that the two pose, and in particular, let's say in the military domain. In the long run, the challenge from China, I think, is much greater. I think the prospects for Russia actually successfully conducting large-scale military operations that would extend a long distance from its borders are limited and likely to remain so, which isn't to say that they couldn't do some very problematic things immediately around their periphery, including against the Baltic states. But of course, the current administration has kind of put these two together in talking about a new era of great power competition, and I understand that, and I think there's a reason for doing that. But it is important, I think, to distinguish the nature of the challenge that's posed by the two. Russia is a declining and deteriorating power. I think its strategy is aimed much more at destabilization and weakening the West, keeping the West divided and off balance. China benefits from that, even though that's not, they're using very different tactics. But I think Russia is playing a relatively weak hand, whereas China conceivably is playing a much stronger one.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting that when the big new strategies came out, they talked about the two separately. But starting this winter, first in the intelligence community and then in the Department of Defense and State, we've seen that it's the alignment itself that is also a problem. It's not just the two separately. It is the alignment. And that's been a sea change of assessment within the United States government.
Yeah, by the way, just on that, there are still things, even though the Russians had a significant fall off in their investment in their military capabilities and a dramatic deterioration in the quality of their armed forces after the end of the Cold War, they've reversed that to some extent, certainly since 2008. And there are still some areas where they have a great deal of experience, and certainly where over the last 25 years, China has benefited tremendously from transfer of technology, knowledge, expertise. The Soviets were the world's leading authorities on how to try to track American submarines. They were the ones who first explored the possibility of anti-ship ballistic missiles. They have developed some remarkable weapons, supercavitating torpedoes and so on, that the Chinese have been interested in. So they still have some areas of expertise that from which the Chinese benefit just in the military domain.
One last shot. If you go back to, say, 1939-40, before Japan swept out of China and in 1941, if you went back there, it was still very possible, had the United States had a strategic foreign and defense policy, instead of being driven by the Neutrality Acts and isolationism, which was absolute reverse strategic. I mean, unbelievable to study that period, how we encouraged aggression by promising not to be involved when we were the principal actor, potentially in international affairs. But in any case, had we not been in that state of mind, we could have deterred Japan and Asia. Had we just told Japan, you know, we're not going to deal with Nazi Germany right now, but we're going to, you know, we're focused on you. Don't do anything anymore. Japan would not have invaded Southeast Asia. It would have not bombed Pearl Harbor. So there were ways to deter then, which I think are analogous to our situation today.
All right, do we have time for some questions? All right, start there.
Can people identify themselves?
Yeah, if you could stand up and let us know who you are and where you're from.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an Intel analyst and a former diplomat. I think if you are locking up 1.5 million people, you have lost the right to rule over almost a quarter of mankind. And so I've got to ask the question. I mean, we know often who's got bank accounts overseas. We often know who's got 2 girlfriends and probably what their names are. We often know whose house is 5 times bigger than his salary. So when did we lose our ability to conduct massive information operations and break that great firewall into crumbs? We can do this, and I'm just puzzled that this campaign hasn't started. So can you talk about that, why we're so placid here?
It extends not just to the human rights but it extends to, for instance, IP theft. Anytime you're going to, and of course it would not just be an information thing, that when you start talking about that level of information, you're going to have to talk about sanctions. It's one thing to try to make a hullabaloo about 1.5 million or 2 Uyghurs in concentration camps. It's another thing to do something about them, because we do talk about that. So I guess what I've wondered over time is why we have not targeted specific individuals and entities in actually punitive ways. We've labeled some, you know, had indictments against some, for instance, Chinese actors, which we would never be able to reach. So shouldn't we start utilizing sanctions in a way that really end up with serious penalties that would send a signal globally, but also to other actors, say, within China? I'm not, well, that's a different question. Yeah. That's another question, but I'm talking about seeking to alter the balance of understanding and influence in this long-term strategic competition in which human rights is a critical portion. We were founded by Scoop Jackson, so I'm, the NBR was, so I am completely open and excited about trying to the integration of these things in foreign policy. But anyway, yeah, I have questions myself of why we haven't sought greater penalties in circumstances to assert our own values, make them clearer in contradistinction to these. That would be very helpful. Send out a clear signal to Chinese what our values are that we stand for.
Yeah, just on starting with the focus on the Uyghur question, and there's a broader set of issues that I think you're raising. The answer to your question as to why we haven't done some of these things, I mean, it's partly a matter of degree. It's not that we haven't done anything, but I do think that there's been a reluctance to sort of take the gloves off and adopt a posture that was much more confrontational towards China. And, not without some reason. I think that reluctance continues. It's a question of whether you want to start to go down that road and appear to be doing things that are intended to undermine, weaken the regime. I think we're closer to contemplating the possibility that we might do that than we've been in 30 years. I also think that some of that sensitivity and anxiety on our part is exaggerated, in part because it seems to me that the regime believes we are doing this 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, no matter what we say. If you look at some of the commentary on what's happening in Hong Kong, Chinese officials and commentators say, and I suspect they believe, that 2 million people are out in the streets of Hong Kong because of the activities of Western agitators and the United States government and international media creating problems where they don't exist. There is a paranoia about a regime that is not confident in its own legitimacy that we can't alleviate no matter what we do. As far as responding to this particular set of issues, and by the way, I think this is an example of something that the regime is doing, which in the long run may be extremely important in mobilizing international opposition to what it's doing across the board. It really shocks the conscience of mankind, I think, to recognize that in this day and age, you have a regime that's maintaining concentration camps that contain millions of people who are there purely by virtue of the fact that the regime suspects them of being susceptible to extremist appeals. Rich has mentioned the possibility of sanctions against individuals, the application of the Magnitsky Act, which has been used against Russian officials, potentially against Chinese the CCP officials who are connected with this activity is one thing that's been raised by some people in Congress. There's going to be a question about American and Western participation in the Olympics coming up, which are to be held in China, and that seems like perhaps a secondary or tertiary issue, but it's not. I think that there's going to be a very active debate about whether, in fact, Western democratic countries want to take part in these games in a country that's doing the kinds of things that the CCP regime is doing. As far as the Great Firewall and information operations and so on, and there are many, many things wrapped up in that. And again, I think it's not that we haven't tried to do some of these things. There's more that could be done.
Hasn't the CCP been fairly effective in monitoring social media?
They've been effective in restricting the inward flow of information. They've been effective in monitoring and when they see the need, disrupting internal flows of information. But, and this is the sort of X factor, they've also been successful to a degree which is a little bit difficult to anticipate from outside in inoculating their own people against some of the messages that we might like to deliver by arguing, for example, that the West seeks to hold down China and undermine China, and that it's motivated by racist sentiments and a variety of other lies, frankly. But specifically on the question of Uyghurs, I'm not sure if you took a poll what average Chinese, who are mostly Han people, would say about what's happening in Western China. And I'm afraid that some portion of them would say these people, the Uyghurs, are dangerous or they're ungrateful, or we're trying to help them develop, similar things to what people have said about what's happened in Tibet. So we shouldn't assume that if we flip the switch and flood all this information into China, it will have the effects that we would desire, which isn't to say we shouldn't do it. But the situation is more complicated than it was, for example, during the latter stages of the Cold War, where you had people on the other side of the Iron Curtain who pretty clearly were hungry for information and very receptive, as it turned out, to the kinds of things that Western entities were broadcasting and transmitting. This is a more complicated problem.
Yeah, and going back to your first point, Aaron, today, when it comes to sanctioning individuals or countries, in particular China, over whatever, our complex relations, the complex interests we have, the enormous economic interests, the companies and so on. So our lobbies here in Washington, non-human rights lobbies, are almost always against these kinds of sanctions because they're going to disrupt business. They're going to disrupt the global economy potentially. So in the case of China, this is an extraordinary concern versus what it was in the Cold War.
Or any other country that we're dealing with today.
Or any other country.
Russia, for example.
Right.
So there's a concern, I think it's legitimate, that if we start issuing warrants or arresting people around the world and trying to bring them to justice for things that they've done, Chinese officials, as we've seen, are perfectly willing to do the same to foreign nationals on their territory. They've been very careful not yet to do it to Americans, not prominent people. There are some people with dual citizenship that were in legal difficulty in China. But again, there's a reluctance to go further down that road. And it's understandable. We have to weigh the costs and benefits of ratcheting up this atmosphere of confrontation and competition even above where it is now.
All right, I think we have another question here.
Dan Lieberman. Yes, I noticed in the annual release of new products like in the automobile industry and footwear and computers and smartphones, that they all seem to have the same features and same styles. In other words, they're copying from each other. Yeah. So it seems in multiple of industries, there is an awful lot of intellectual property theft. And even much greater than China is shown. So I was wondering if pointing out China intellectual property theft is just really pointing them out because we're antagonistic to China, but they're no different than the other countries. And the other question is, can you show in any particular industries where proven intellectual property theft by China has hurt a particular industry? I mean, proven intellectual property theft, not just good marketing. Thank you.
Sure, happy to. Let me just reiterate something I said earlier. From all the studies that have been conducted in Europe, North America in particular, China accounts for 80 to 90% of global intellectual property theft. And the examples, of course, involved millions and millions of American jobs that have been lost. I can give you lots of details, but I want to give you two examples which will, each one of which exemplifies a different component of the problem. There is an industrial policy that simply ranks what they're out to do, the kinds of industries they are out to dominate, excel at and dominate. And then if you look at property theft statistics, interestingly, they correlate with those industrial priorities, whether in the 2025 or just the annual the 5-year plans and the updates to the plans and so on. So there's a correlation between evidence of theft and those. That's one category, which is party state directed, incentivized, and they're incentivized to do this in all kinds of ways. There are subsidies. They are rewarded for patents, even though the patent may be a foreign patent. You patent it in China, you get paid for it. It goes on and on. But you are achieving the party state's goals if you can effectively steal the stuff and make it in China, and especially the higher tech, again, with those goals. That's one category. The other category of intellectual property theft that, again, is 80, 90% from China is China's just simply saying to its fantastic entrepreneurial population, go for it. And so there's just a lot across the board. And if you go on Alibaba and anyway, go on these websites, look at the court cases and so on. It's a fantastic array of industries from countertops, quartz countertops, to sprinkler heads, to all kinds of non-strategic things in which the intellectual property has been stolen. Some cases, a product precisely, even to the color and markings on it, replicated. There's a tremendous amount of re-engineering today. We only can do it today, and Chinese can do it especially well, because of modern technologies. In the old days, re-engineering was very difficult. Now, it's much easier. But in any case, an incredible array of standard, normal products you would not believe, which are simply, so then produced in China with absolutely no research, subsidized, paid to patent that American product, for example, or European product in China, and then ship it over here, undercutting the local, and that company goes out of business. I can name there are so many examples, but I wanted to give you a sense of the industrial policy kind of core that you always hear about, but I would argue a much more massive across the societal board. An anecdote: go to a trade show in the Midwest sometime, industrial trade show, latest automotive parts or whatever they are, and you will find Chinese citizens all over the place, in teams and individually, taking pictures of the latest gizmo, trying to get as much information about it as possible, purchasing it on the internet, however you get it. It's an amazing phenomenon. So it's a societal issue that has been unleashed, and it is also an industrial policy.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. This is,
massive.
What Richard said. It's as compared to any other country or historical period, it's the scope and volume of the theft and transfer of intellectual property, and also the extent to which it is state promoted and state enabled. So intelligence agencies in China have been directly involved in penetration of computer networks, not only in foreign governments, but corporations, and the extraction and exfiltration of enormous volumes of information about the design of products across an entire array, including military systems, but not only that. So the extent to which government in China is supporting this, and it is a part, as Rich has said, of a larger industrial policy. There's also, within China itself, and Rich mentioned the activities of firms that are pursuing their own interests, very weak to non-existent enforcement of intellectual property rights of foreign entities. So it's virtually impossible for Western companies to pursue legal cases against Chinese entities, certainly not in China, that are engaged in pretty blatant theft. And that too is a reflection of government policy. If they wanted to enforce them, they could. And the United States and other Western countries have been pressuring and trying to get China to do more in this regard for decades. It's one of the reasons why we are in the current confrontation that we are with them over trade. As far as examples, there are many, many examples. I think the best kind of summation of at least one slice of this that I've seen lately, it was a long article in the Wall Street Journal last month about Huawei. It's a result of an investigative report, and it talks at length about, over a period of decades, the interaction between Huawei and various Western companies from whom Huawei stole technology, and in many cases those potential competitors went out of business. And that's information, again, that's available in the records of legal cases that have been brought in courts in the United States and elsewhere. So I don't think there's a whole lot of doubt about it. There may be arguments about the aggregate impact, and in many cases what the various factors involved were. But I think it was General Alexander who said this is the largest theft and transfer of intellectual property in the history of the modern world.
Of wealth.
Of wealth.
Of wealth.
So it's not just a few things here and there. It's absolutely central to China's development policies, which, if I could say, and again, something Rich said earlier, are key to its strategic objectives. This is not solely or even primarily for purposes of promoting the well-being of Chinese people, ordinary Chinese people, or even the wealth of Chinese companies. It's for purposes of promoting the power of the Chinese party state in relation to its society, but also in relation to other countries, in particular the United States. It's not incidental, it's central.
Yeah, and it goes back 40 years. So So from the very get-go, the Chinese understood the extent to which, for instance, our federal labs were vulnerable, our universities, and how we conduct research and how open our professors are, and so on. So when you think about it, you don't want to equate this with cyber. Cyber is a very important component, but in most of the effective cases, it's involved employees, knowledge of processes brought by employees. It is physical, industrial espionage with Chinese spies, in addition, working in cahoots with companies and so on. It's a massive effort. What brought it, and I think for those of you who are involved in think tanks here over the last few decades, you'll recall about 15 years ago, there was a whole spate of attacks on think tanks in the United States. Cyber attacks, but in many cases, those cyber attacks were conducted simultaneously with physical surveillance. There'd be physical surveillance, then a person that you were dealing with was impersonated in an email and so on, and it ended up a major attack by the Chinese government, by Chinese attackers. And so that brought it, of course, to our attention at NBR. We were a little more sophisticated than a lot of them. We had programmers, and we were kind of doing this sort of stuff. But we wondered at that time, my gosh, if they're spending a huge amount of time and resources on a think tank, what are they doing with regard to institutions that have real secrets, that are really, important? And so we started paying more attention to it. It's that massive. It involves human capital every bit as much as cyber.
Just one quick word on the technology issue. It's central to the regime's efforts to achieve its objectives in every domain, in the economic domain, in military competition, in control of its own population. Technology, which at this point still has to be acquired in key areas from the West, is central to the regime's goals and plans. That's why it's pushing so hard to acquire that technology.
Yeah, and I would say one other thing, and you all know, I know you're all familiar with this, but really this technology does seem to suggest that the first truly totalitarian state could be built. It's being tested in Xinjiang, but this technology does look like it holds the potential for societal control, unlike even authors of 1984 and similar books could contemplate.
Well, on that ominous note, I think we're out of time. Please join me in thanking our panel.